The Story of the Redeemer, as told by Captain Alistair Sutherland, Trojan Horse International, UK, CM. The tale of the Redeemer begins in 1979 amidst the troubled waters of the China Sea. Captain Dennis Collins and Chief Officer Maurice Diddy were aboard Logos 1 when they encountered a dire scene. Several small boats overcrowded with Vietnamese refugees in extreme distress. These poor souls, escaping persecution following the communist takeover, had been brutalized by pirates and left to drift without food, water, or shelter. Educated individuals and those who spoke French had become enemies of the state, and many had fled by sea with what little gold they possessed. Pirates preyed on them mercilessly. Logos 1 took around 100 of them aboard for treatment, but tragically, during the night, their small vessels capsized. No country wished to take the refugees in, and this incident sowed the seeds of a vision in the hearts of Maurice and Denise, a vision for a ship of their own, dedicated to mercy and mission. Years later, both men left Logos 1, and Maurice reconnected with some of those very refugees who had found their way to England. This led him to establish a project in Woolwich, London, focused on supporting both the refugees and those living on the streets. He bought a house for the work, and after some 6 or 7 years, set his sights again on acquiring a suitable vessel. He found her in the Castor, one of 7 robust Dutch-built post-war vessels originally intended to serve as pilot ships and naval reserves. It's said the Castor was even built with the royal family's evacuation in mind, should the Cold War turn hot. Maurice sold the Woolwich house and used the funds to purchase and rename the ship Redeemer. She was soon bound for Vietnam, but ultimately made Malta her home port. For the next 10 years, she plied the Mediterranean during the summer months, visiting ports for Christian outreach whenever there were enough volunteer crew. Like the OM ships, the crew were expected to raise their own support, and this made things difficult. Despite financial strain, Maurice made good use of their time in Malta, building bridges between various Christian groups. He and his wife Hilary spent a decade on the ship, raising their 2 children aboard. Hilary even took a teaching post to help support the work. In 1997, the decision was made to bring Redeemer back to England and start afresh with a firmer financial footing. She arrived in Falmouth in July that year. As for me, I came to faith in 1979 while piloting a ship into Southampton. By chance, I berthed her just behind the Doulos, the other OM ship. I visited her the next day and told the chief officer that I felt God might be calling me to serve on a ship. But at the time, I was still drinking and living selfishly. I knew I wasn't ready. A while later, I was meant to join a ship in Brixham, but bad weather diverted her to Liverpool, so I was reassigned to pilot a Greek vessel from Dover to Antwerp. While changing trains at Waterloo, I decided to visit the OM ship's office in Bromley, having heard of it from a young lady I'd once met on a train. They didn't need a captain then, but gave me a picture of YWAM's Anastasis, which was being refitted in Greece as a Christian hospital ship. I said at the time, "I've got a cushy job piloting ships. No crew troubles, no paperwork. I go from port to port, sign the bill, and go home. Best job I ever had." But my marriage was falling apart, largely due to my own way of life. That Christmas, I had nowhere to go. I ended up with a Christian group called Abundant Life, connected to Anastasis. They were using a country house near Crawley to rehabilitate young people. I stayed there 2 years, doing DIY and carpentry, while continuing to pilot ships as needed. During that time, I visited Israel for the Feast of Tabernacles. One day, as I was preparing to leave for another pilot job, I popped into the post office. One of the leaders of Abundant Life was waiting outside and mentioned that Anastasis was ready to sail. I said, "Tell the captain I'll help if he wants me." 2 minutes later, I was off to catch my flight. Days later, the call came, "We need you." I left everything and flew to Greece. I ended up spending 3.5 years with YWAM's Mercy ships. When I eventually needed paid work again, I sailed coasters between Portsmouth, the Channel Islands, and France for 2 years. But I never lost touch with the Feast of Tabernacles in Israel. In 1983, I decided to stay in Jerusalem. After 3 months while in prayer, Acts 28, verse 11 came to mind. And after 3 months, we departed in a ship of Alexandria, which had wintered in the isle, whose sign was Castor and Pollux. That same verse had helped Don Stevens decide to purchase Anastasis. Shortly after, the postmaster in French Hill said to me, "Captain, when are you going back to your ship?" I took that as confirmation. With only £25 and 4 days to find the rest, I bought a ticket to England, and sure enough, a check arrived just in time. I flew home for Christmas, stayed with my naval cousin in Emsworth, then bought another ticket to Hawaii. Again, the funds came through. I arrived in Hawaii the same day Anastasis did from the South Pacific. Later, I became master of the Good Samaritan, YWAM's second mercy ship. I helped fit her out in Jacksonville, Florida. I was always on the lookout for a ship to carry Jewish returnees from Russia to Israel. I connected with a man in Jerusalem named Joe Galiska, who wanted to do just that. But the funding, locked up in a trust called Exe Homo, including a priceless ruby carved with the face of Christ, was never released. I returned to the States, lived in Reston, Virginia, and eventually ended up in South Africa, serving first as a ship's master and then with Ark Ministries, helping street people. Later, I took a tug to Cape Town and stayed there, joining another ship for 4 years. I had hoped she'd be given to me for Christian use, but she was instead turned into a restaurant. The Doulos came to Cape Town for refit, and I was invited to join her again. I sailed with her on and off for 18 months. During my time in Cape Town, Acts 28:11 came to me again. I jotted it in my Bible and wrote to Glenn Haynes in Jerusalem, who'd started Ships of Tarshish. I believe the verse was a sign. Eventually, while docked in the Seychelles aboard Doulos, I received a call from Maurice about the Redeemer. I already knew Maurice from Denise Collins, and I'd also been shown the plans of Redeemer by Johannes Thomson on the Doulos. As soon as I returned to England, after visiting my former home in Kenya, I joined Redeemer in Malta. I stayed for 3.5 years. Not long after boarding, I discovered that Redeemer had originally been called Castor. A week before we sailed to England, her sister ship Pollux berthed behind us. We arrived in Falmouth in July 1997. The others disembarked, but I stayed to mind the ship. Eventually, Maurice returned with crew, and we moved her to a mooring buoy. Later, we sailed her upriver to a layup berth. One weekend, I changed plans and attended a meeting in Bristol, where David Hathaway was preaching. Through a series of coincidences, I met him and offered him the ship for Christian work in Russia. A brother from Australia came to oversee things, and we moved Redeemer to Portland. After 9 months and a breakdown in communication, the ship was sold to Patrick. I accompanied Redeemer to Urk in Holland and remained with her until autumn 1998, when I returned to England, got married, and settled in Poole. I kept in touch with Patrick and even supervised dry docking for another sister ship, Procyon, in Tampico, Mexico. There I met Captain Ulises from Cuba and Manuel from Cancun, who later converted Ulises to Christ aboard the ship. I also stayed briefly with the uncle of one of the watchmen, a Presbyterian pastor in a village called Mata Redondo, and so I returned to England and continued to work. But I've always felt that Redeemer and all the ships like her were part of God's greater plan. Photographs and further details may be obtained from Maurice, who, even before owning Redeemer, had ministered to refugees in Malaya, many of whom had been violently mistreated or killed trying to come ashore. His heart, like the ship's name, was always set on redemption. Captain Alistair Sutherland,